I prayed saying, "My God, please don't let my children go hungry." Shortly after, my son said, "Mom, what is that in the dog's mouth?" "It's a miracle. Thank you, my God." The story you're about to hear is real. The names of the characters and places have been changed to protect their privacy. If you believe in miracles or have experienced one, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe. Oh my God, how can I forget those days in our little town in Mexico? We were so poor that sometimes I wondered if even the air we breathed would cost us something one day. I was a middle-aged woman with 4 small children and a husband who worked hard when he could. The youngest, my baby, was only 2 months old. So fragile, so innocent. Our little house was humble, but clean. I made sure of that. The peeling walls told stories of better times. But for us, it was home. Every morning, I rose with the sun and began to sing. Yes, sing. Can you believe it? In the midst of such need, I sang praises to God. "Mom, why are you always singing?" my eldest son Juanito would ask, his eyes full of curiosity. "Oh, my love," I would reply, hugging him tightly. "I sing because God is with us. Always. In good times and bad." But let me confess something. There were nights when, after putting the children to bed, I would sit in the kitchen and cry silently. Tears would fall on my calloused hands, witnesses to so much hard work. In those moments, I wondered if God really heard us. One day, while I was washing clothes in the yard, I heard my 2 daughters arguing inside. "I'm hungry," little Maria shouted. "Shh, be quiet," Lupe, the eldest, replied. "Don't you see that Mom is worried?" I froze, my hands in the soapy water. Was it that obvious? Could my children see through my smile? I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. That night, as I served dinner, just tortillas with beans, the only thing we had left, I watched how my children looked at their plates with hungry eyes. My heart sank. "Mom," Juanito suddenly said, "why don't we have meat like the Martinez family?" I felt like I was choking. How do you explain to a child that we barely had the basics? I swallowed hard and replied, "Son, every family is different. We have love, and that's worth more than any meat." I saw how they exchanged glances. They didn't believe me, I know. But what else could I tell them? That night, after putting them to bed, I sat at the door of the house, looking at the stars. Our little dog, Leon, curled up at my feet. I stroked his caramel-colored fur and whispered, "Olan, what are we going to do?" The silence of the night was my only answer. But something inside me, a stubborn little voice, told me not to lose faith. That God was listening, that He was watching us. That soon, very soon, things would change. Little did I know, as they say, how soon and in what unexpected way that change would come. But that, my dears, is another part of the story. A part that still makes me tremble when I remember it, because it was the day I saw with my own eyes that miracles exist. That morning began like any other, but there was something in the air, a strange feeling that I couldn't explain. I woke up before dawn as always, but this time with a knot in my stomach. When I opened the cupboard, my heart sank. It was completely empty. "My God," I whispered, "what are we going to do?" My husband, Pedro, woke up and found me there, frozen in front of the empty shelves. "What's wrong, Rosita?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Everything's gone, Pedro," I said, my voice breaking. "We have nothing to feed the kids." I saw how his face darkened. He came closer and hugged me tightly, so tight that I almost couldn't breathe. "I'm going out to look for work," he said with determination. "I'll come back with food, I promise you." "But, Pedro," I began to say, knowing how hard it was to find work in our small town. "Don't worry, my love," he interrupted me, kissing my forehead. "God will provide." I watched him leave with a heavy heart. What if he didn't find anything? What would I tell the kids? The hours passed slowly, as if time was mocking our situation. The children woke up, and I had to fake a smile as I told them breakfast would be a little late. "But I'm hungry, Mom," Maria, my 4-year-old, complained. "I know, sweetheart," I said, stroking her hair. "Papa will be back soon with delicious food." But as the day went on, my worry grew. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and pink, and Pedro still hadn't returned. The children's stomachs were growling, and each complaint was like a dagger to my heart. "Mom, when are we going to eat?" Lupe asked, her big brown eyes filled with concern. I swallowed hard, trying to loosen the knot in my throat. "Soon, my love. Very soon." But the truth was, I had no idea when or how we would eat. Fear consumed me, and I felt like the walls of the house were closing in on me. I decided it was best to put the kids to bed. "Let's take a little nap," I said, forcing a smile. "When you wake up, we'll have a big surprise." "A surprise with food?" Juanito asked, hopefully. "Yes, my love," I lied, feeling my heart break a little more. A big surprise with food. As I tucked them in, I could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't fully believe me, I knew. But they stayed quiet, probably too tired and hungry to protest. Once the children were in bed, I felt I could no longer maintain the facade. The tears I had been holding back all day finally found their way to my cheeks. I ran to our small room, closed the door, and collapsed on the floor. "Oh God," I sobbed, my voice barely a whisper. "Please don't let my children go hungry. They are so small, so innocent. They don't understand why there's no food." My hands trembled as I clasped them in prayer. "I've never asked you for anything for myself, Lord, but I beg you, help my children. Show me a sign, anything. We need a miracle." The silence that followed my desperate prayer was deafening. I could hear the pounding of my own heart, fast and strong. Had God heard me? Or were we truly alone in this? Suddenly, I heard a noise at the front door. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be Pedro? I jumped up, wiped my tears with the back of my hand, and rushed to the entrance. There he was, my Pedro, but the expression on his face told me everything I needed to know before he uttered a single word. He came empty-handed. "Rosita," he said, his voice barely a broken whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't find anything." We looked at each other, the weight of our situation pressing down on us like a stone. What were we going to do? How were we going to feed our children? It was in that moment of utter despair that we heard small footsteps approaching. Our oldest son, Juanito, had woken up and was looking at us with sleepy, confused eyes. "Mom, Dad, what's going on?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Is the food surprise ready?" I felt my heart break into 1,000 pieces. How could we explain to a child that there was no food, that there wouldn't be a surprise? But before we could answer, something incredible happened. Something that would change our lives forever, and that, to this day, makes me believe in miracles. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, life took another turn. There we were, Pedro and I, frozen in front of Juanito, not knowing what to say. The silence was so heavy I could almost touch it. "Son," Pedro began, his voice trembling, the surprise is going to take a little longer." I saw Juanito's eyes fill with tears. "But I'm hungry, Dad," he said in a small voice. At that moment, I felt something inside me break. I couldn't bear it anymore. I knelt in front of my son and hugged him with all my might. "My love," I said, struggling to hold back my own tears, "go back to bed with your siblings. Mom and Dad are going to figure this out, I promise you." Juanito nodded, not entirely convinced, and returned to the children's room. As soon as he disappeared from our sight, I collapsed. The tears I had been holding back all day finally found their way to my cheeks. Pedro hugged me, and for a moment we stayed like that, crying silently, our bodies trembling from the stifled sobs. How had we come to this point? How is it possible that we couldn't feed our own children? "I have to do something," I said suddenly, pulling away from Pedro. "I can't just sit here and do nothing." "What are you going to do, Rosita?" Pedro asked, his voice heavy with concern. "I'm going to pray," I replied with determination. "I'm going to talk to God until he listens." Pedro looked at me with a mix of admiration and doubt. "Okay, my love. I'll stay here in case the kids wake up." I walked to our small room, closing the door behind me. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint light of the moon seeping through the window. I knelt beside the bed, bringing my trembling hands together. "Oh God," I began, my voice barely a whisper, "I know you've always been with us. I know you've taken care of us in difficult times. But now, Lord, I need you more than ever." The words began to flow, like a river overflowing after a storm. My children are hungry, Lord. They are so small, so innocent. They don't understand why there's no food on the table. They don't understand why their stomachs hurt. I don't know what else to do. My tears fell onto the sheets, forming small dark spots. I've never asked you for anything for myself, my God. I've always accepted what you've given me with gratitude. But now I beg you, help my children. They don't deserve to suffer like this. My voice broke, and for a moment, I could only cry silently. The weight of our situation crushed me, robbing me of breath. Lord, I continued after a while, I know you are all-powerful. I know that nothing is impossible for you. I ask you, I plead with you, to send us a miracle. It doesn't have to be big, Lord. Just enough to feed my children tonight. As I prayed, I felt a strange warmth in my chest. It was as if a small flame had ignited within me, giving me strength. I trust you, Lord, I said with renewed conviction. I know you haven't abandoned us. I know you are listening. Please show us the way. Give us a sign, anything. We need to know we are not alone in this. I don't know how long I spent like that on my knees, talking to God. It could have been an hour, it could have been all night. I lost track of time, immersed in my conversation with the Lord. Suddenly, I heard a noise that snapped me out of my trance. It was the sound of the front door opening. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be? I jumped up, wiping my tears with the back of my hand. I rushed out of the room, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste. Pedro? I called, my voice filled with hope. But when I reached the living room, I froze. It wasn't Pedro who had come in. It was Leon, our little caramel-colored dog. He stood at the door, looking at us with his big brown eyes. And in his mouth. Oh God, I whispered, unable to believe what I saw. Pedro came closer to me, his face a mix of confusion and amazement. Rosita, what is that? What does Leon have in his mouth? I couldn't respond. The words were stuck in my throat. Because what Leon had in his mouth, what our little dog had brought home at our greatest moment of despair, was something I could never have imagined. It was at that precise moment that I realized God had truly heard me. That the miracle I had been pleading for was about to manifest in the most unexpected way possible. There we were, Pedro and I, looking at Leon as if he were an apparition. Our little caramel-colored dog, who had always been more mouth than anything else, now held something in his mouth that we couldn't identify in the dim light of the living room. Pedro, I whispered, not daring to move. What is that? My husband took a cautious step forward. I don't know, Rosita. It looks like paper. At that moment, Juanito appeared again, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Mom, Dad, what's going on? I heard noises. Before we could respond, his eyes widened at the sight of Len. Look, Len brought something. As if those words were a signal, Len approached us, timidly wagging his tail. He dropped what he had in his mouth at our feet and stepped back a bit, as if waiting for our reaction. Pedro bent down to pick up the mysterious object. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted it. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I could see it was a small roll of something. My God, Pedro gasped, his voice barely audible. Rosita, it's money. I felt my legs weaken. Money? How was that possible? I moved closer to Pedro, my eyes fixed on the small roll he held in his hands. Where did this come from? I asked, my voice trembling with both excitement and fear. Pedro began to carefully unroll the wad of bills, as if he feared they might disappear at any moment. As the bills were revealed, our eyes grew wider and wider. There's enough here to buy food for the whole week, Pedro murmured, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. Juanito, who had been silently watching the entire time, finally spoke. Does that mean we'll get the food surprise, Mom? His innocent question snapped me out of the trance I was in. Suddenly, the reality of our situation hit me with full force. Yes, we had money now, but where had it come from? How had Len gotten it? Pedro, I said, my voice heavy with concern. What if this money is stolen? I saw my husband's face pale at the thought. The money he held in his hands, our temporary salvation, suddenly seemed to weigh a ton. We can't keep it if it's stolen, Rosita, Pedro said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. It wouldn't be right. I felt my heart sink. After all the despair, after all the prayers, was this yet another test? Or was it the answer we had been waiting for? But Dad, Juanito interrupted, his eyes filling with tears, we're hungry. Can't we just use it to buy some food? Our son's words were like a dagger to my heart. How could we explain to a hungry child that we couldn't use the money that seemed to have fallen from the sky? Pedro and I exchanged a look, the anguish reflected in our eyes. We were at a moral crossroads we had never imagined facing. We have to find out where this money came from, Pedro finally said, his voice filled with determination. We can't use it until we're sure we're not doing something wrong. I nodded, though every fiber of my being screamed to take that money and run to buy food for our hungry children. But I knew Pedro was right. We couldn't build our future on a lie or theft. So, what are we going to do? I asked, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. Pedro looked at the money in his hands, then at Len, who was still quietly sitting, watching us with his big brown eyes. I'm going out, he finally said. I'm going to ask around the neighborhood if anyone lost money. If no one claims it, then maybe, just maybe, this is truly the miracle we've been waiting for. I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and hope in my heart. What if someone claimed the money? Would we be back to where we started? But then again, what if no one claimed it? Could this really be an answer to our prayers? As Pedro prepared to leave, I knelt down beside Len and hugged him tightly. Thank you, I whispered in his ear, though I wasn't sure exactly why I was thanking him. Juanito came up to me, his little arms wrapped around my neck. Mom, he said softly, do you think God sent us that money? His question took my breath away for a moment. How could I explain to a child the complexity of our situation? How could I talk about faith and miracles when I wasn't even sure what was happening myself? I don't know, my love, I replied honestly. But I do know that God is watching over us, one way or another. As I watched Pedro disappear into the night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, hope, confusion, gratitude, they all swirled together in my heart. I didn't know what the future would hold, but at that moment, holding my child and our faithful Len, I felt that, no matter what, we weren't alone. And so, with my heart in suspense, we waited for Pedro's return, not knowing whether he would bring good or bad news, but clinging to the hope that somehow, everything would turn out all right. Minutes turned into hours as we waited for Pedro to come back. Juanito had fallen asleep in my arms, exhausted from hunger and excitement. Len had curled up at my feet, his presence a strange comfort amidst so much uncertainty. Every noise in the street made my heart leap. Could it be Pedro returning? Would he bring good or bad news? The night seemed endless. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the first rays of dawn, I heard footsteps approaching the door. I stood up carefully, leaving Juanito asleep on the couch, and ran to the entrance. Pedro walked in, his face a mixture of exhaustion and, was that a smile? Rosita, he said softly, closing the door behind him. You won't believe what happened. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might leap out of my chest. What? What happened, Pedro? Did someone claim the money? Pedro shook his head, his smile growing. No, my love. No one claimed it. But that's not the most incredible part. He stepped closer to me, taking my hands in his. I went around the whole neighborhood, asking door to door. No one had lost any money. I was about to return when I decided to stop by the church. He paused, as if reliving the moment in his mind. The church was open, Rosita. Father Miguel was there, preparing for the morning mass. I told him everything that had happened, showed him the money that Len had brought. Pedro squeezed my hands, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. And do you know what he told me? He said that yesterday afternoon, a wealthy woman from town had come to the church. She wanted to make an anonymous donation to help needy families. She gave Father Miguel an envelope with money and asked him to distribute it to those who needed it most. I felt like I was running out of air. Could it be? Father Miguel left the envelope on the altar while he finished some chores, Pedro continued. When he returned, the envelope had disappeared. He thought he had put it away and forgotten about it, but now, Now he believes that Len somehow entered the church and took the envelope. I finished the sentence, my voice barely a whisper. Pedro nodded, tears now streaming freely down his cheeks. Father Miguel says it's a miracle, Rosita. He says that God used Len to bring us the help we needed. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by emotion. Len, as if sensing we were talking about him, approached and rested his head on my lap. I hugged him, sobbing with joy and gratitude. So, can we keep the money? I asked through tears. Pedro knelt beside me, wrapping his arms around Len and me. Yes, my love. Father Miguel says it's ours. That God wanted us to have it. At that moment, Juanito woke up, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Mom? Dad? What's happening? Pedro called him with a gesture, and our son joined our group hug. God has sent us a miracle, son, Pedro said, his voice filled with emotion. So are we going to have food? Juanito asked, his eyes shining with hope. Yes, my love, I replied, kissing his forehead. We're going to have food and much more. As we sat there, embraced on the floor of our humble home, with Len licking our faces as if he understood the magnitude of the moment, I felt a wave of gratitude so intense that I thought my heart would burst. Pedro got up, helping me to my feet. I'm going to the market right now, he said, his voice full of renewed energy. I'll bring food for everyone. And afterwards, we'll go to church to give thanks. I nodded, unable to speak for the emotion. As Pedro left, I stayed there, with Juanito wrapped around my waist and Len at my feet, looking out the window at the sun rising on the horizon, bathing our small village in its golden light. In that moment, I understood that I had witnessed a true miracle. Not just the miracle of the money that appeared when we needed it most, but the miracle of faith that never abandoned us, the miracle of love that kept us united in the darkest times. I looked at Len, our little four-legged hero, and smiled through my tears. Thank you, I whispered to him, stroking his soft fur. Thank you for being the angel that God sent to save us. And as we awaited Pedro's return with the food we longed for, I felt a deep peace wash over me. I knew that whatever happened in the future, we would always have this moment, this miracle, to remind us that faith can move mountains and that love, in all its forms, even in the shape of a little caramel-colored dog, can work wonders. Years have passed since that miraculous day, but the memory remains as vivid in my mind as if it happened yesterday. Every time I look at my children, now grown and strong, I can't help but think about how our lives changed from that moment. That morning, when Pedro returned from the market loaded with bags full of food, our children shouted with joy. We prepared a feast like we had never had before. Eggs, beans, fresh tortillas, even a little meat. The aroma filled our small house, and for the first time in a long time, I heard my children's carefree laughter. As we ate, we told them the story of how Len had brought us the miracle. Their eyes widened in disbelief as they heard how our little dog had become the family hero. So God used Len to help us? Asked Maria, our little one, with her mouth full of beans. That's right, my love, I replied, petting Len, who sat by the table as if he understood we were talking about him. God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes he uses the smallest and most unexpected creatures to do great things. After the meal, just as we had promised, we all went to church together. Father Miguel welcomed us with a warm smile, and together, we gave thanks for the miracle we had received. But the miracle didn't end there. The story of Len and the mysterious money quickly spread throughout the village. People began to see us differently. We were no longer just the poor family struggling to survive. We became a symbol of hope, a reminder that miracles can happen when you least expect them. With the money left over after buying food, Pedro was able to invest in tools for his work. Gradually, our situation began to improve. We didn't get rich overnight, but we no longer went hungry. Our children could continue in school, and although life remained difficult at times, we never felt as desperate as we had that night. Len lived several more years, always faithful, always by our side. When he finally left us, we buried him in our backyard, under the tree where he liked to rest. We planted flowers around his grave, a small tribute to our four-legged hero. Now, sitting on the porch of our home, watching my grandchildren play in the yard, I can't help but reflect on everything we've lived through. Life hasn't been easy, but every obstacle, every difficult moment has taught me something valuable about faith and perseverance. There are those who, upon hearing our story, dismiss it as mere coincidence. A dog bringing money home? Impossible, they say. Some have even suggested that perhaps Pedro or I took the money from the church and invented the story of Len to cover our actions. But I know the truth. I know what I saw that night, the desperation we felt, and the miraculous relief that came in our darkest hour. I don't need anyone else to believe it. My faith doesn't depend on others' approval. What I do is share our story with anyone who wants to listen. Not to convince, but to inspire. To remind people that miracles exist, that faith can move mountains, and that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Every night, before going to sleep, I look at the picture of Len we have in the living room. His faithful gaze, his caramel-colored fur, remind me that God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes his angels have 4 legs and a tail. Thank you, I whisper every night. Not only to Len, but to God, to the universe, to whatever force sent us that miracle when we needed it most. And to all who hear our story, I say, keep the faith. No matter how dark the night may seem, dawn always arrives. And sometimes, just before dawn, a miracle comes with 4 paws and a heart full of love. Because in the end, that's what I learned from all of this. Miracles are not just supernatural or inexplicable events. Miracles are in the love that surrounds us, in the faith that sustains us in difficult times, in the kindness of strangers, and yes, sometimes in a little dog that becomes the most improbable hero. Our story may seem incredible, but for those who have faith, for those who have experienced unexpected kindness in their darkest moments, they know that miracles exist. They are all around us every day, if only we open our hearts to see them. And so, as the sun sets on our small village, while my grandchildren run to my arms asking me to tell them once again the story of the miracle dog, I smile. Because I know that this story, our story, will live on, inspiring faith and hope for generations. Because miracles, big or small, remind us that we are never truly alone. And that, my dear ones, is the most valuable lesson of all.